Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts.
Hello, everybody in the sport psych world. Thanks for joining me for another sports psych concepts lecture recording. I want to continue on with this thread of thinking that I've been having lately, and that's doing more presentations geared toward coaches. So this is my sports psychology for coaches thread of presentations, and I want to talk today about how to tailor your coaching approach to the unique needs of different populations, because this is the thing in the coaching world is like, well, we're not just talking about coaching professional athletes or college athletes, elite club athletes. It's youth athletes. There's athletes with learning disabilities. You could be working with masters or senior level athletes. There's a whole range. And so there's key considerations to keep in mind when you're working with these different groups. And so that's what I want to talk about today. The goal is really just to show how, coaches can use a sort of flexible or empathetic coaching style to make sure that they can connect with every athlete on their team, even if they're working with athletes that all involved, belong to the same particular age group or whatever categorization there is being adaptable in our approach and understanding that the needs of our athletes can be different. So I want to start, of course, in chronological order here. We'll start with coaching young athletes, and I worked with a lot of young athletes in this age range of 4 years to 11 years. That's how I'm defining, a young athlete, a youth athlete here. And there's a few things to keep in mind when we're coaching kids. Probably the most critical factor, and it's like a no-brainer, it's a no-duh thing, but the most critical factor is to make the experience fun and enjoyable, right? I mean, that's what keeps them engaged. That's what prevents them from dropping out of sport. And the attrition rates in sport are incredibly high these days. Lots of kids will start and then they don't really have a great experience and they drop out. And a big part of that is it just wasn't fun. It wasn't enjoyable. And I'm not saying that sports are going to be for every kid. There's lots of things that kids can be interested in and more interested in than sports, but it is kind of a shame to think that a big reason that many kids drop out is just because it wasn't fun, and many times it's because of the environment that coaches created for that. And so as a coach, we want to be a source of positive reinforcement, just over and over and over again, like this is a great place to be, and we want athletes to feel that. And so some basic things to keep in mind that are more actionable, I guess we could say, rather than principle based. I mean, it's all principle based, but let's just say we're working with a kid and we're trying to give them some instructions, we're explaining a drill, and I've seen this I don't know how many times. Coaches at a practice with a youth sport practice, and the coach is standing there talking and the kids are sitting there listening, not playing, not running around, not active, and the coach is talking. And obviously coaches need to do that. It's very, very important, but we want our instructions to be simple and direct. And we need to be aware of our own behavior, how we're acting, what it is that we're doing, and with in terms of our body language, right? What is it that we're communicating or conveying in addition to what it is that we're saying with that? Okay? And so to extend this a little bit further, when coaches use more of a sort of external focus. Okay, so now we're getting really down to the nitty gritty, right? We want our instructions to be simple and direct, kids can understand those things. And then when we're working with them, we want to use more of an external focus when we're coaching them, right? We're talking to them. This is a really great thing developmentally for them. They can grasp. This is telling the athlete what to do with the ball or their body rather than like what they are feeling internally. Okay, so this is really important, right? This is youth athletes. What's something that I can do? I'm trying to be simple and clear and all of that, and how I'm channeling my body language and how I'm demonstrating, and I'm not getting too much into detail and say, oh yeah, well, like you need to feel that this tension right here between this muscle and then this is going to get tight and then this is going to feel relaxed over here, and you go like kids, they can't think abstractly. Kids of this age, they just can't grasp those sorts of things. So focus on the effect and external focus. What is it that they're trying to accomplish with the implement that they're using, the ball, whatever, they're swinging a racket, or just the effect? Which direction do they need to move their body? So they're looking externally rather than internally. That's going to be much more effective for learning in this age group. Now, much more could be said about this age group. You're just getting a little smattering of a few ideas of some things that I think are particularly important. So hopefully that is helpful. So now let's shift to the next age group, looking at adolescence. So I'm defining this as ages 12 up to 17. Obviously, adolescence is a period of significant change for athletes. And so the behavior of coaches becomes more important than ever, because the athletes are just they're more, maybe more aware of things. They're paying attention to different things than little kids. Little kids, you can get away with a lot of things. They're just not as aware. Kids get into this age group and they're much more aware of things. And so the actions of coaches really are strongly linked to athlete motivation, and can even be linked to aggressive behavior on the field. The types of things that we say and suggesting and how we're acting, then athletes, adolescents can go and play those things out, like go and hurt that guy, get him on the field, or whatever we're saying, depending on the type of sport that we're doing. And so we want to be aware of those things, because as coaches, the athletes are going through this sort of identity development stage, and so they're going to try different things on, including the types of things that we suggest or we project in our own behavior. So we want to, as coaches, be a source of stability and support, where we're creating that environment, that caring environment, where athletes feel safe, of course, but also valued. And so when coaches when we make our practice sessions, they're challenging, but they're realistic, we can actually help in these instances reduce some of the high dropout rates that we see in this age group in particular, right? We see it across the spectrum. Lots of kids try sports, they start, but then there's big time dropout as you move across these age groups. And especially, like I was saying, that identity development is really a prime component of kids in this age group, on just what they're going through. They're figuring out who they are as an individual, and so they'll try a lot of different things, and if they have bad experiences, then they'll move away from that fairly quickly. They won't persist with that. And so coaches play a really, really important role in that process. Now let's talk about coaching adults. And I realize I'm really just scraping the surface, just barely scraping the surface. Much more could be said about these things, so just keep that in mind. I'm just throwing you a few ideas from the perspective of mental performance and things that we should pay attention to when we're working with these different populations. But so technically, if we start talking about coaching adults, we're shifting away from the realm of pedagogy, which is basically refers to learning in kids, to now looking at andragogy, which is adult learning. And kids are not miniature adults. I should have said that earlier. Kids are not miniature adults. So it's not like you're just doing the same thing with kids. It doesn't mean that the same principles, the same ideas, you want them to learn the same basic skills. Those are the same. But kids don't think as well abstractly, especially young ones. When they move through adolescence, they can start understanding those things, think more in complicated terms, understanding more lengthy descriptions or explanations. Adults, they're going to be much more self-directed. They want to know the why behind what they're doing. So adolescents as well, that certainly applies there, but adults definitely appreciate that when you give them a logical rationale and explanation for what they're doing and how it fits into the context. So I've worked with a lot of adult athletes in my own career, and I certainly can attest to that piece. So if we're doing that, that's a really powerful tool. We also can enhance their learning by using different analogies that they can relate to, and not talking too much, right? Especially if we're working with adults and they're paying for the time. Like we want them to get reps. We want them to get repetitions. So we're not just overly describing, because there's a sweet spot with this. It can be challenging when you're working with some adults because they want the explanation, they want the why, but they don't need to understand it at the level that you understand it. You need to understand, let's just say, like the biomechanics of a movement, and even maybe even you bring in some physics terms and you're talking about joint angles and all of this stuff and the direction of force and all these cool things, these awesome concepts. You can have an understanding of that, but they don't need to have that understanding. You can bring that in. It's measured. You got to meet them where they are on that. So there's kind of an art. This is the art of coaching piece. Is like you understand the science, but then you deliver that through artistic expression and how you're explaining those things. Okay, so not explaining the why, but not talking too much, using analogies to simplify what it is that we're trying to get them to do. And then when we do that, ultimately it allows them to solve their problems, to figure things out on their own rather than us just handing it to them. And so using the principles of guided discovery can be really powerful here, where we're walking along with them. We're not just directing everything that it is they do, because we don't want them to be dependent on us. We want them to get to the point to where they can kind of figure this stuff out and do it on their own. Okay. And then the last thing I'll mention here is that it's really important to remind these adults of the benefits of learning new things, doing different things, trying things that are maybe uncomfortable outside of their wheelhouse. And many times they'll be curious and interested in those things anyways, but sometimes they may just be comfortable where they are. And so they can be pushed too, right? They can be pushed too. Like, how do we get better? How do we find things that we can keep improving? Maybe we need to try some new things. It's going to feel different. You might actually get a little bit worse before you get better, but explaining that can help them keep the motivation up when they go through those experiences. All right, so now let's shift and talk a little bit about a special population, athletes with learning disabilities. And as coaches, you work in different realms, you're going to come across these athletes. This isn't just like there's a whole spectrum here, right? When we're talking about learning disabilities, of course, we have the Special Olympics, and that's an awesome event and organization that runs and does those things. And so maybe you work in that particular realm, but that's not even necessarily what I'm talking about. That's one end of the spectrum. You'll have athletes who are going to be on a high school sports team, or they could be an adult athlete taking a tennis lesson, or it could be a younger kid, anywhere along the way, to where you could have an athlete who's somewhere has some level of a learning disability. And I'm talking about, it could be like visual perception abilities. It could be like ADHD. It could be like dyslexia. I mean, there's a number of different things. Someone could be on the autism spectrum. So lots of things that could be included here. And so we'll run into these types of athletes. So it's good to have an idea and an awareness and sort of expectation going in with that, of like, all right, most likely I'm going to have some athletes or somewhere here. How can I create a supportive and inclusive environment where they can succeed, they can benefit from this sporting experience as much as anybody? And that's the idea of sport, right? Something that we're trying to promote. Now, a simple sort of actionable tip right here is we can adapt our coaching with all of these groups of athletes that I've talked about. We have different populations. That's the name of the game. We need to be able to adapt. And so when we're working with athletes that maybe have some learning disability, it becomes imperative to use those short, simple, descriptions, explanations, sentences, and how we're describing things, and maybe visual aids. Okay, so demonstration can be powerful. Maybe the visual demonstrations are more powerful than the verbal explanations. Okay, just finding different ways to help these athletes process the information is really good. You can also look into, universal design for learning principles. There's all sorts of things out there that take those things into consideration if we're trying to design sessions that can pull everyone in on the team, regardless of their learning style or whatever challenges that they're faced with, and this can work exceedingly well. Now, obviously, there are very real limitations. And so one of the last things I'll mention on this is, rather than emphasize the limitations, assume that these individuals can do something rather than assume that they can't do something. And you'll probably be surprised. Probably be surprised is what you'll end up finding out, as you have some determination from these athletes. So it can be a cool population to work with. All right, now I'm going to shift gears in a direction that maybe you didn't anticipate, because we've talked about young athletes, adolescents, adults, athletes with learning disabilities as its own special population, and now we're shifting and saying, well, what about athletes who have sort of perfectionistic attitudes? How do we work with those athletes? And this is kind of a fun one to think about, because perfectionism, in many ways, it's often thought of as a positive trait in sport. Like they're striving for perfectionism. They're trying to get it as good as it possibly can be. But it does have a dark side. It can certainly lead to burnout, anxiety, and other mental health issues if it's not a more of an adaptive trait. So as a coach, you can help your athletes recognize their perfectionistic tendencies. I remember teammates that I've had that definitely fell into this category. It's like, whoa, man, like talk about being hard on yourself if it didn't go exactly the way that you kind of envisioned in your mind, which it rarely does. So there's the kind of this competing reality of what maybe the ideal would be, but what is actually realistic in terms of real life. So a strategy here I want to share is to help these athletes identify when their standards are becoming unhelpful. Okay, so when is your standard becoming unhelpful? What is the limit there? Because having high standards is great. It's awesome. You want to have high standards, you want to aim high, it's wonderful. But at what point does it become unhelpful? And so that's a powerful question. It's something that you can help athletes. You can teach them this idea to help them become more self-aware. Okay, so like I said, the goal here isn't to get rid of their high standards, but it's to help them find a healthy balance between those high standards by promoting self-compassion. Okay, to where they recognize that they are human, and most likely they're not gonna be perfect at everything that they attempt to do in their sport or most anywhere else in life. Like, perfection is unrealistic. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive and have those really high standards, because then that's where we find out what our limits are. And so it's just framing it in that proper backdrop can really be helpful for these athletes who might struggle with this. And so the last group I want to mention today, which really could be its own topic, and indeed I've done other presentations on this, is working with athletes who have injuries. Now, injuries are obviously an unfortunate occurrence in the sporting world, but not uncommon. It's definitely a common part of an athlete's experience. It certainly was for mine. And it can be really stressful for athletes during this time. It's a difficult period to work through for them. So as coaches, we have to understand that injured athletes, when they go through that, they'll experience a range of emotions. So you can have anger on one end, sadness, depression, anxiety, and fear, for sure, especially a fear of re-injury. So we need to understand that at the at the outset here. And so your role as a coach is to provide some level of psychological support here. Okay, and I could just, well, you're providing support. What does that look like? Because it can look a number of different ways, but psychological support, being there, supporting them. So it could be, well, you staying in regular contact with them. You're finding ways to keep them involved with the team, inviting them in, supporting that basic need of relatedness or sense of belonging and connection, supporting those things. Still finding ways for them to feel like they have a sense of autonomy over the process and what they're going through, because that one really gets thrown out the window when they're trying to recover from an injury, because it feels like everything's just happening to them. And then eventually when they get to that point to where they're physically ready to return, recognize that they may not be psychologically ready to return. And so knowing that up front and helping them address that and overcome that fear of getting re-injured would be a big time priority. Okay, so some special needs here in this particular group of athletes that no doubt if you coach long enough, you're going to run into this and can be a real challenge if you don't have this basic understanding of those things that I've shared here. So to wrap things up, the most effective coaches are those who can adapt their style to the unique needs of each athlete. Now, those athletes may fall in different categories like I shared today. So whether you're coaching the young child who needs to have fun and enjoyment, or you've got a teenager who's navigating a high stakes competition, maybe for the first time, or you're just working with an adult learning a new skill, the approach that you use matters. And so we want to be adaptable, empathetic. We need to be knowledgeable about the specific challenges and the strengths of each of those populations, especially the one that we're going to be working with, right? It's not going to be the same. So we can't just assume, well, I've worked with this particular group before, and so I'm just going to go do the same thing with this particular group because I know how to coach, and so I can just apply it broad scale and any perspective that I am. That's not necessarily going to work. So if we do all of the things, adhere to just some of the general principles that I've shared today, that's how we can create that more inclusive and ultimately successful environment for as many of our athletes as possible, which is certainly a worthy goal. So that's all I have for today. Thanks again for listening. Hope all is going well in your world. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this recording in the Sports Psych Lecture Series. I hope you learned something. More importantly, I hope you learned something that you can apply in your life. Feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube, or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify, or visit my website at fehradvantage.com.